both sides of the house believes that protest in a democracy is ultimately a pretty good thing, right? And that protest in any given democracy is something that's required because it voices out the voice of the people, right? From the proposition, there's only one difference, is that we hamper on the keyword new democracies and whether or not we can use protest in this form of new democracies. So we have no idea what in the world the closing bench is talking about, because all they talked about was all the bad points of protesting in any given form of democracy. So we think that's a big contradiction towards the opening side, given the fact that the opening side does recognize that protesting is a good thing, just not for the first 2 years. So we think that there's an inherent contradiction in today's debate. Now, secondly, we think that we don't really get this point. They come up and talk about, are we basing our whole case on the whole assumption that medias are not free? Our answer is yes, of course, yes, for three main reasons. Firstly, it's because your opening bench has already based it on, because they allow medias, they say, well, there's always checks and balances in media, so they're assuming that, this is right or wrong. On the second level, we agree. On the second level, we say this is what happens in most new democracy anyway. I think our opening bench has done a pretty good job. They talk about it. On the third level, we say, in case where this is true, what are you going to do to have checks and balances in the end of the day? We think that's a fundamental question in which the opening bench and closing bench did not talk about. So let's take a look at the justifications from the entire bench, both the opening and closing. What are the justifications to not having protests in a new democracies? They talk about five main justifications. First, they talk about stability. Basically, both the first and second speaker, opening and closing, talked about that. They talk about the values created through protests and therefore lead to instability. Then thirdly, they talked about how the inclusion of protests would give opposition leader the power to turn the regime back to authoritarian, which we think is a twisted idea. Then they talked about checks and balances. And finally, they talked about how protest is a very dangerous thing coming from the closing bench. Let me talk about it one by one. Firstly, they talk about these things of values created and how it's going to create instability within the end of the day. We think that's absurd, because if you're going to allow medias and TVs, if you allow people to voice out their voice in any other form, under your logic, these insecurities and instability will occur anyways. So we don't see how your logic makes any sense. But on a second level, they talk about this whole sense of how inclusion of protest is going to give too much power to the opposition and therefore turning the regime back to authoritarian. We think that's a very absurd idea, because firstly, you're basing the whole entire assumption that protest is always from strong leader of opposition, that there are always radical groups and always want to turn people back to authoritarian rule. But we say, even if that's the case, people can still protest against that government, and that's how democracies work in the end of the day. But on the second level, we're talking about more inherent problems in today's debate, and what that is, we're talking about individual citizens protesting for their own rights because they're not happy with the government, and we think that that's the fundamental question that needs to be answered in today's debate. Finally, they talk about this whole thing about checks and balances, something from the closing bench. They talk about, well, you know what, people can always represent their voice through parliaments. Mr. Speaker, we don't think it's fair that we as an individual citizen has only one chance every 4 years to check some balances about our votes, to vote against our government in this particular case. In cases between the 4 years where we want to demand a change, what are you going to do? Sit and listen and smoke pot? We don't think so. Yes?
Well, in every democracy around the world that's representative, you only get a chance to vote somebody out every 4 years. Surely that's a better option using the media.
Of course, in every democracy in the world, protest is legal, unlike what you're proposing in today's debate. Now, so fundamentally, what are we talking about, and what's the most initial and fundamental idea in today's debate? Is whether or not stability can be created in the short run in today's debate versus a clash of right of the people, something the opening bench talked about. But what the closing bench is going to bring to you, has brought to you in today's debate, is we're going to clash directly with the key idea in today's debate, and that is stability within the short run. They argue that stability is bad. We say, no, if you shut these people down, stability is going to be even worse than under the status quo. The second thing that the closing bench has brought to you is we brought you into this idea of how successful democracies can only occur when you allow people to protest. take a seat. Let's talk about the first things first. This whole idea about stability. Because they come up and talk about, well, in cases where people in cases where people are where the new democracies are still new, there's going to be instability within society. Firstly, we don't think that's necessarily the case. On the second level, we also think that, look, what happens is when you don't allow people to protest, the government then always uses stability as a key excuse to shut their people down, saying that, hey, look, for security-wise, we're going to take away your rights. The idea here is, especially in new democracies, checks and balances is always at a minimal level, right? So we think that in this particular case, people need to be able to protest. In cases where people want to voice out their voice and they're being shut down, their whole assumption, underlying assumption, is that people will say, well, you know, maybe we have to change. We don't think so. We think that's exactly why revolutions occur and exactly why people protest through very even more violent means, because they don't understand, the government doesn't listen to the people. We think that is exactly how terrorist organization functions, because the government don't listen to their voice at the end of the day. So you can't assume that people are just going to be there, because when people chooses to resort to protest, they've already given to a particular certain value. The moment, take a seat, the moment you shut them off, what happens is they then provide this revenge mechanism, and they want to voice out not through your protest anymore in the legal democratic form where you would go register, but in this case through even more violent means. So we think that in case of stability, which is the key argument in which your whole bench is based on, we think that in terms of stability, we think that if you shut these people off, in the end of the day, stability is going to be even worse. And that's something that's very, very important in today's debate. But on a second level, I think you're out of order. But on the second level, we talk about this whole sense about why we believe that protest is needed in order for successful democracy to occur. And even in reality, Mr. Speaker, because we talked about this whole thing about why democracy itself is a clash of ideas, and why democracy itself is a clash of ideas and power, and it is something that people demand. We think that through protest, not only is it the right of the people, but in addition to that, we think that through protest, it brings about negotiation power between the people and the government. The opposition, closing opposition, says, well, you can't give us an example. We got examples of the United States of America in Martin Luther King's era, where people rise for this, where black people rise for their own rights, and that is eventually how they got their rights. We got cases of Indonesia where people weren't happy about Suharto, and it eventually brought the president back. We got examples in Thailand, for example, coming from a Thailand bench, where people rise up, and that's where checks and balances eventually occurred. So don't tell me that there are no examples under that. But then essentially what happens is that this is the rise of protest that gives people the power to negotiate with the government. And this is the absolute form of checks and balances, and we believe that this is something that's most important to this debate. Because ultimately what we're talking about is what's best for the people in the end of the day. Is it to shut them off and allow them to retaliate later, and therefore further damaging stability, or is it to allow them to protest? Ladies and gentlemen, we stand strong and firm. We believe protesting is the better option. Thank you.